Okay, thank you. Before I start this one, I just want to say a few words about the next one. So the next one will be next Thursday. It'll be an argument from the concept of the finite to God. It will be, in a way, a philosophy of mathematics talk, but it will be highly non-technical as philosophy of mathematics talks go. And to force it to be non-technical, my children will be here, and I will try to make it comprehensible to them, too. Okay, so a bit of review of what happened last time for the people who weren't here. So this talk has two main parts. The first is an argument for something like Aristotelian forms, and the second part is an argument from there to God. So Aristotle thinks we have three main components in a substance, like in us: matter, form, and accident. The form does at least three different things. It unifies the matter into the thing. It offers objective norms for the thing's functioning as the kind of thing it is. But it doesn't just unhelpfully offer these norms, but it pushes the thing's characteristic activity towards the fulfillment of them. These norms, which are going to be my focus in the arguments, do not reduce to either statistical facts about the actual functioning of the things or to beliefs by the thing or by society or by anything else about what those norms are. And the form of a number of the arguments has been to ask what I call Mersenne questions, which come from this odd argument for the existence of God that Mersenne gave in 1624, which focuses our attention on the fact that the world is full of extremely fine detail, like particular distances between the sun and the earth, particular varieties of strength in different organisms, particular facts about all sorts of planets, and all sorts of other stuff like that, which comes in detail. And Mersenne thought that the sheer number of such facts and their intricacy indicated that there was contingency at work, that this wasn't just a matter of necessity, and he thought it was not the sort of thing that could be given a scientific explanation, and so he concluded there was an explanation in terms of God. I think he was probably mistaken about the particular examples he gave being incapable of scientific explanation. In fact, I'm pretty sure he was mistaken about that. But in the spirit of Mersenne's argument, I've been offering other arguments involving parameters in areas that are not subject to scientific study, such as the norms of ethics and the norms of epistemology, is what I talked about last time. This time, I will talk about semantics briefly, a bit of metaphysics, and then with a little bit more length, philosophy of mind, which is joint work of Rob Koons. And finally, I will move to the transition between forms and God. So semantics, right? We already talked a bit about vagueness last time. So we've got classic questions like how many grains of sand does it take to have a heap? And when we think about these kinds of cases, classical logic, and I gave an argument in the ethics case to this, pulls us towards epistemicism, which is the view that there are answers to these questions, because after all, everything is either true or false, and so on. But these are answers that are beyond our knowledge. So there are facts about how many grains of sand you need to have a heap, perhaps, or it seems like there are, but it's hard to see. It's hard for us to figure out what those facts are, but that's not the question I want to raise here, is how we know those facts. Rather, I want to ask this question of what makes these facts be the facts they are. Given epistemicism about vagueness, each vague predicate raises a Mersenne type question as to why the boundaries of the predicate are where they are. So, I mean, let's just think about sort of an obvious little argument. So we have symbolic items in the world, words, gestures, perhaps thoughts as well. These symbolic items, by definition of symbolic, have meaning. The typical ones get their meaning through convention. They get their meaning through a convention that is established symbolically. So, for example, you can, dub things by pointing and saying a word for them. When you do this kind of dubbing, this by social convention assigning a meaning, you use earlier meaningful symbolic items to give meaning to later ones. So pointing needs to have a meaning for you to be able to dub by pointing. You have to have it established that pointing points in this direction rather than, say, along the finger in this way or in some other way. So when we give meaning to symbolic items from other symbolic items, we typically, we get a regress. Symbolic items getting their meaning from other symbolic items. This is a regress which has to terminate. This is not like in the cosmological argument where you might wonder, maybe the regress of causes goes on forever, because of course the regress of symbolic items does not go on forever because the human race hasn't been around for very long, geologically speaking, and certainly a finite amount of time. So there has to be initial symbolic items which have a meaning that is not derivative from earlier ones. So the question is, where do those items get their meaning? And the suggestion I want to make is that if you have forms, one of the things they can do for you is they can provide norms of meaning for the fundamental symbolic items. Maybe pointing, maybe smiling. I don't know what those exactly are. This meaning could be either perfectly precise or have perfectly precise vagueness profiles, thereby answering the Mersenne questions about the fundamental symbolic items and any vagueness in them. Obviously, pointing has some vagueness to it, perhaps only an epistemicist kind of vagueness, but it still has some kind of vagueness. What exactly you're pointing to? Am I pointing to this bottle, or to a lectern behind it, or to the label on the bottle? Once we have the fundamental symbolic items, we can get an explanation of where the precise boundaries of the meanings of the other things come from. Namely, they come from the precise boundaries on the fundamental items. Together, perhaps with other rules written in the human nature, in the form of the human being, that specify how one derive things from fundamental ones. This is very brief. Again, it could work on a completely determined epistemicism on which there's always a fact of the matter as to everything, or it could work on an epistemicism which says you could have vagueness, genuine vagueness, but at some higher level it will bottom out in perfectly precise ways. Maybe there'll be a precise boundary between being bold, being definitely bold, being vaguely bold, and being definitely non-bold, or maybe the boundary will be at a higher level. Second kind of application, we have a number of applications of forms in metaphysics. So we've got the classic, by now, special composition problem, which pluralities of material objects form a whole. So intuitively, this eraser and this bottle do not form a whole, but on the other hand, the particles in my body do form a whole. So which pluralities form a whole? The Aristotelian who believes in forms can say, now the answer is not actually in terms of the norms in the form, it's just the answer is very simply those things, those pluralities, that partake of a form, that have a form together. This is my student Christopher Tomaszewski's pursuing this argument in his dissertation. What are the alternatives to this kind of view? I think there are four main alternatives in the metaphysics literature. The first one, which I'm actually inclined to think is true, so I'm actually not that happy with this argument, is nihilism, which is highly counterintuitive. It says never, the only time pluralities make up a whole is if the plurality is only of one thing. On this view, either we don't exist or we are simples. I actually think I am an extended simple. I'm not going to defend that. That is an absurd view, though I happen to think it's true. If you want to push me, if you're drawn to it, then you won't like this argument. Second option is universalism, which is to say, which is the opposite one, which is to say always, every plurality makes up an object. And that makes for lots of objects. It's counterintuitive also, just like nihilism is counterintuitive. You know, it means that there is the thing made of this and of this. But I think there's actually something fairly arbitrary if you stop, there's something ad hoc if you just stop at universalism and say that you've got, that any bunch of stuff in this world makes up a whole. It seems to me that if you're in this, if you have the intuitions and the philosophical needs that pull you towards saying that any bunch of objects in this world make up a whole, you should also do this across worlds and allow for any number of, for what people call any modal profile to be exemplified with a thing. So there may be an object which in this world is constituted by this, and in another world, maybe the world where I come too late to give this lecture, it is constituted by this. So it's kind of like a trans-world universal, a trans-world mereological sum, not exactly mereological sum, but something like that. It seems to me that the kinds of things that lead people to universalism actually pull in that direction, because one of the main reasons for universalism is we want to be able to accommodate intuitions like there exist tables and chairs and dogs and cats and all these things. And all of these things have modal profiles that are sometimes somewhat weird, especially the tables and chairs and the artifacts, where the modal profiles seem to have a lot to do with our social conventions. If we think we have to include any particular sum of things to have such gerrymandered entities as tables and chairs, then I think we should include any possible modal profile as well. This has the very curious result that there is no set of all material objects, because there are so many modal profiles, because there are so many possible worlds. The possible worlds, in fact, are too many to form a set. It's not hard to argue for that. And so if you're going to have modal profiles across all worlds and all the possible modal profiles exemplified, you will have incredible numbers of objects all located in one place. There's this bottle with its normal modal profile. Then there's the bottle with that weird modal profile where in the world where I don't show up for the lecture, it turns into this. And you can make up enough modal profiles that you'll go beyond set theory. You'll have like a proper class of material objects in this world. And that's at least seems like too much stuff. It seems like there should be a set of all the material objects in this world. Another option is life. That's famously Peter Van Inwagen's option. I think the concept of life is fairly nebulous apart from some kind of notion of form. Also, I think you're going to get a lot of Mersenne type questions as to what counts as living and what counts as not living, where those boundaries lie. Finally, you have Trenton Merrick's idea that when a plurality has irreducible causal powers, then it forms a whole. So he thinks that plurality of particles in me has irreducible causal powers because it has a mental life. When you put it together, that involves that's an irreducible causal power that doesn't reduce to the powers of the particles, that makes a whole. That view, I think, might be correct. As well, or if nihilism isn't right, this is a pretty good second view. But it's also compatible with the form story. And, and the form story might give you a further explanation as to why you have these new irreducible causal powers, because maybe they arise from the form of the thing. More straightforward questions. The beginning and end. When do material objects come into and out of existence? So you slowly cut down a tree. When does it stop existing? When do gametes joining together form a new organism? It seems like there ought to be precise answers to this. Otherwise, we have existential vagueness, which seems at least counterintuitive. And the Aristotelian can say, the answer is precisely this happens when a form shows up or exits. And the Aristotelian can also answer questions of identity, whether synchronic or diachronic, by saying that things are the same when they have the same form. So we get answers to various questions in semantics, metaphysics, ethics, and so on from forms. Maybe too many answers. That might make you a little suspicious. Okay, what about the mind? Well, I'm drawn to the idea that there's lots of normative stuff that's important in the mind. So, for example, seems plausible to me that at least a part of what makes something be a belief is that sort of thing that should not occur unless its content is true. It's a question, right? So I've got a mind or maybe a brain. There's all this stuff all these events going on, these processes. Which of those processes are beliefs? The suggestion is at least you can do part of the story is it's those things that ought not to occur unless a certain thing is true. And then you can give a similar kind of normative partial characterization. The inferences are those things that should not occur unless Q follows from P. These norms might partially constitute beliefs and inferences, and we need a source for these norms. But I want to focus on a different set of things, that is work with Rob Koons. And for this, I want to talk about a specific theory of mind, which is, I think, the best naturalistic theory of mind, or family of theories of mind, and that's functionalism. There are, of course, interesting arguments for the existence of God from non-naturalistic theories of mind, like dualisms of various sorts. It's hard to give scientific explanations of the existence of souls and so on. But I want to try to see what can be done with a naturalistic one. So I think the best one is a version of functionalism. So we can think on functionalism that thought and consciousness are defined by flowcharts of computational functioning, where we've got these functional things between different boxes. So here's a very simple account of pain, too simple to be correct, that when you have a box in the middle that which is states caused by damage sensors, and that box causes aversive behavior, then that's what makes for pain. Namely, when the system is functioning, it causes pain. That's what constitutes being in pain. And it doesn't matter what's in these boxes. I should have drawn them black to make it clear that they are black boxes rather than blue boxes. You could, as long as you have the same kind of mediation between inputs and outputs, you have the same mental state. And there's good reason to think something like that, and that is that it seems intuitively very plausible that whatever kind of mental functioning we can do with carbon-based neuronal brains could be done with a variety of other evolutionary solutions in other environments than ours. You could have silicon-based brains, or as David Lewis suggests, hydraulic minds, and so on, as long as they have the same kind of, they engage in the same kind of functional computational process, as long as they have, the flowcharts are the same. So I think this kind of a story is probably going to be the best kind of family of stories for a materialist account of mind. But Rob and I want to focus on the fact that things can go wrong in these things. So even when we've got these arrows here, but sometimes things go wrong, and you have an individual who at a particular time, or maybe even over a long period of time, maybe even over their whole life, pain, instead of leading to aversive behavior in them, leads to pursuit behavior because they are a masochist. Or there might be just a temporary glitch where there's a cross-wiring, and instead of this being triggered by the damage sensors, it's triggered by whatever are the opposite of damage sensors, the good state sensors, the ones that normally give us pleasure, I guess. And you could have that happen, and you would still, seems very plausible, you would still feel pain, even if you have this kind of cross-wiring. So what we probably want to say is not that the pain states are those that fit in this place in the flowchart, but that there's the states that normally fit in this place in the flowchart. They are states normally caused by the outputs of damage sensors that normally cause aversive behavior in turn. And if this is right, then functionalism needs a notion of normal or proper functioning. Now, if you're doing computer stuff, of course, you can give a sense of what normal functioning is for a piece of software or hardware in terms of the design of by the maker. You say the maker means for this to lead to this, so that's what makes it be the case, that that normally this leads to this. Well, I don't think that's going to help in our case, even if God exists, but I'll talk a bit about that later. So the question is, what is the source of these norms? What is the source of the norm of what makes for normal functioning? So it seems to me that if you take functionalism and you realize that things can go wrong, you have to have a story on which the arrows are normal arrows, and so you need a notion of the normal. So how might we get that? Well, the most obvious is statistical. The normal is what is most common. And then we have to ask, most common in what? What's the reference class? Well, seem like two main options are the species and the individual. If the normal is what is most common in the species, then whether I am in pain is really rather radically extrinsic to me. I mean, it depends on what's happening in far outside my body, namely what's happening in other people's brains. If it turned out that everybody else is getting rewired so that the output of the box that in me corresponds to pain is now wired to the pursuit of the stimulus, then on a statistical prevalence view of the normal, it's no longer normal for the output of the pain to go to avoidance. And so now it's no longer the case that my system is in fact an instance of a pain system that goes from damage, pain, to avoidance. In fact, what my system now is an abnormal version of a pursuit system. And so now I don't feel pain, I feel pleasure, just because everybody else has been cross-wired outside of me. That seems really implausible. What if it's statistical prevalence in the individual? Well, one kind of problem comes with time. My mental states are sequenced in time. I'm either going to include future states in counting the statistical prevalence or not. If I do include the future states, then whether I am now in pain depends on whether I get cross-wired for the rest of my life. Well, actually, I'm more than halfway done with my life, so maybe it can't be changed for me. But if I was younger, if I got cross-wired for the rest of my life, it would change what's prevalent for me. And that seems a very odd kind of painkiller, is to cross-wire somebody after the fact and make it be that they didn't feel the pain. That seems wrong. If, on the other hand, we only look at prevalence in the present and past, then we have this odd result in the first time, or a couple times maybe it happens, you don't actually feel pain. And that seems a little implausible because you don't have statistics yet. Secondly, it seems very plausible that an individual can have a lifelong flawed functional hookup and still feel pains and so on. So I don't think statistics is going to do the job. I think that was David Lewis's thought that it would. You might try DNA. You could have a DNA normativity theory. The normal is what is coded for in the DNA. So my brain is functioning normally, provided that it's functioning in the way that the DNA coded. Seems to me that it's not quite right. You can have sources of abnormality that are in the DNA, and then you could have a person who pursues the sources of pain who is expressing their faulty DNA quite correctly. Interestingly, I think this is something Rob Koons has made me sensitive to in another context, is there may be a kind of circularity here, because the notion of what is coded for is a normative notion, because what is coded for by the DNA is what ought to result from the DNA. So you might have a normativity there. And finally, it seems like we all have different DNA, and so we'll get different norms for different individuals, unless maybe we're lucky enough that there's enough in common. So I don't think the DNA is the best option. The one that's most common in the literature, most notably pushed by Ruth Millikan, is an evolutionary story. The idea is that the correct functioning is something like the ancestral functioning that explains why the beings with this functioning are still here. So why do I have this damage to pain to avoidance system? Because my ancestors did, and they survived because of it, right? They stopped keeping their hands in the fire before they got all burnt up and so on, and they avoided. They learned that it's being bitten by tigers hurts, and they avoided, and therefore they avoided tigers, and hence they reproduced, and so on. So the idea is what makes it be the correct functioning is that it was in fact the functioning that, in the case of pain, presumably millions of years ago, helped my ancestors to survive. Objections. The first one, maybe it's not super strong, but it's worth registering at least a little bit of an counterintuitive idea that the first organism that exhibits this neural system does not actually have the mental states on this view, because it doesn't have there are no ancestors in which that system was functioning to make it survive. So interestingly, you've got this mutation that produces this pain system. The first organism with that mutation is a zombie with respect to pain. Its descendants have the pains. Okay, maybe that's just counterintuitive. We're so far away from the first ones anyway, this doesn't really affect us. Secondly, this is Rob Koons' thought, the notion of ancestry Rob thinks, and I think he's right about this, depends on the notion of reproduction. And reproduction is a functional notion itself, because reproduction is not just copying. It's something that ought to be copying. It's not, of course, the evolution depends precisely on the fact that it's not exact copying, it's not exact duplication, like maybe in a crystal growth or something. It's imperfect duplication, but what makes it be reproduction is that it's supposed to be close. And the supposed to be is functional. So, and you're not going to, I think, be able to get an evolutionary account of the proper function in reproduction in this story. Finally, you get very radical extrinsicness, I think. So here's one version, a simple version of the story. This doesn't actually work on Millikan's version for technical reasons. I have a little thing at the bottom that does work on Millikan's version, but it works on some of the other versions that are, in some ways, I think, better than Millikan's. So suppose I have two people, Sam and Lucy. They're genetically abnormal individuals. In them, pain leads to pursuit of the stimulus for genetic reasons. They are masochists. Aliens are highly interested in their abnormality. It's a curious thing for them. And so they kidnap them and take them away to Mars, where on Mars they have a child. The child has the same gene. Now, here are two possible ways this scenario could go. One way it could go is everything after that on Earth stays much as it was. In that case, maybe we can still say that in the child we have improper functioning because everybody else on Earth is different, and most of the ancestral history is ones where this hookup from damage to pain to avoidance was in fact helpful. And so when it's damage to pain to pursuit, that's abnormal. And so in that case, we could say in the child still feels pain. And that seems the intuitive thing to say. Just the fact of kidnapping shouldn't change anything. But now imagine that the aliens have killed off everybody on Earth. Or not even the same ones, a different set of aliens have killed off everybody on Earth. Now the child of Sam and Lucy survives, exists only because its ancestors, namely Sam and Lucy, had the system of damage, pain, pursuit, because that was the system whose having caused the aliens to kidnap them and make them survive the apocalypse that wiped out everybody else. So that means that you can change whether somebody feels pain on Mars by wiping out everybody on Earth. That seems very strange. I mean, you could even imagine there's some kind of causal barrier between the two places. So you could actually change whether somebody feels pain across a causal barrier. That doesn't seem right. That seems too much extrinsicness. I mean, maybe certain forms of extrinsicness of mental functioning are okay, like the kind in maximalist principles, but not this much. So I don't think evolution is going to do the job. Evolution might explain why we in fact have this kind of hookup, but it's not going to explain why that hookup is normal. What about God? I mean, I said earlier that software engineers can determine what is normal for a piece of software, and hardware engineers can do it for a piece of hardware. Maybe God is like an engineer setting parameters for normal functioning by fiat. Plantinga says things like that. I don't like divine command theory, so I won't like that. I don't like that in ethics, but I think it's even more implausible in the case of the mind. It doesn't seem like a fiat by someone extrinsic to us can affect whether we are conscious or not, just what God's plan is. So that if God creates us with one set of intentions on his part, we are conscious, and if he creates us with another one, we are zombies. That just doesn't seem very plausible. That again makes mental functioning too extrinsic on our part. So I think God cannot do this directly. Form can. Forms are intrinsic features of the entities that have them. They specify what is normal in the entity. The story supports multiple realizability. It may be that, I don't know, maybe the human form has some multiple realizability. I've got a student who's working on the question whether prosthetics can be literally our body parts in an Aristotelian system, and she thinks the answer is yes. So you might be able to get some multiple realizability. You could maybe get a prosthetic brain and still keep on thinking. I'm not sure about that. I stare a bit incredulously at some of the things my student says, but maybe she's right. But in any case, even if our form doesn't allow for multiple realizability of these functional systems, you could have another form that does. So, very plausibly, the Martians, with their hydraulic systems that David Lewis talks about in Mad and Martian Pain, will have Martian forms which will specify the norms for the hydraulic systems. And so you can have mind in all sorts of things. This kind of functionalism married to Aristotelian forms is in some sense a naturalistic theory of mind, in the sense that our human metaphysical constituents on this theory could well be exactly those that all material substances have. They all have form, matter, and accidents. That's what makes them be substances. So in that sense, it could be naturalistic. There need not be any special kind of ingredient in us as far as this story goes. If you don't like naturalism, if you prefer a more dualistic story, then you can go for Aristotle's more historical, the historical Aristotle's theory of mind, and that involves form as well. Okay, so we have, this time I talked about 3 other kinds of uses you can get out of Aristotelian forms. You can get uses in semantics, in metaphysics, and in philosophy of mind. So let's transition to the God question. This is lectures on natural theology, after all. Aristotle was not a theist. He believed in gods. The gods played some kind of teleological role in the world. Things imitated them and therefore behaved in certain ways. But they didn't make the world. And they didn't need to, Aristotle would think, because the world was eternal and unchanging at the level of kinds. Obviously, there is change within a kind. You get new kinds, new individuals, and the new individuals have new accidents and so on. But at the level of kinds, if you have weasels now, you've always had weasels, and you will always have weasels. And if you had humans, you now have humans and will always have humans. And so it's a nice little story where you've got things of the same form typically coming from things of the same form. And it seems to work fairly well in this non-theistic setting. It's a lot harder to be a seriously Aristotelian non-theist now, I think. By seriously, I mean taking the forms to be irreducible, or at least not reducible to just the physical arrangement of the bits of stuff making up the thing, but genuinely normative things that cannot be read off from the physical arrangement of stuff, as on less serious Aristotelians like Koslitsky they can. So a modern day Aristotelian has to tackle the fact that we have 2 parallel sequences. We have the parallel sequence that science talks about, say particles arranged ape-wise leading to particles arranged human-wise, is, I don't know when exactly, something like 100,000 years ago, of the order of magnitude of that. And then you've got this parallel thing that science doesn't talk about, but the Aristotelian metaphysician has, which is that the ape form is succeeded by the human forms. Succeeded in the sense that the parents have the ape form and the child has the human form. Very odd. We didn't have that in Aristotle. So once you add evolution to a mix, the Aristotelian story becomes more puzzling, right? So what explains the transitions of forms? We can put this in terms of normativity, right? So this is before maybe the change to human beings from apes, but it wasn't normal for for our distant ancestors to walk upright. It is normal for us. What changed? The normal doesn't reduce to statistics or to evolution unless you're willing to lose the applications of the normal, I think. DNA doesn't ground the normativity, but maybe you could say transitions in DNA cause transitions in form. I think that would lead to our old Bain, the Mersenne question again, just shifting over where it lies, because we'd wonder, why do these transitions in DNA lead to these changes in norms? The function from the DNA to the norms is incredibly complicated if there is going to be one, and it seems very likely that it's highly arbitrary, or at least looks highly arbitrary. So what makes for these normative transitions? So let me just list a couple of these puzzling explananda here. So here's some other related ones. So forms are typically only found in the matter that is apt for them, we think. Or at least Aristotelians think, right? So you don't find the human form in what looks like a worm. Well, except maybe a human embryo, insofar as a human embryo looks like a worm, but a mature worm. You don't find a worm form in a human. Like it'd just be utterly incredible that turns out this is just a defective worm. Should be crawling, but it's got these appendages and is talking in these ways, and it's really bad at eating dirt. Just finds itself disgusted by it. It's really screwed up. We don't think that. So forms are typically found in matter that's apt for them. Things typically behave normally and are usually found in their natural environment. Again, this seems important to the Aristotelian story. It's how we get any kind of epistemic access to the forms. Or it's one of the main ways we get epistemic access to forms is by the fact that even though the statistical normativity, the statistical typicality does not define the normal, they are nonetheless correlated. The ecosystem has a kind of normative coherence. Things do not find themselves typically in ecological niches where they don't, which are abnormal for them. Maybe there are some exceptions. You might wonder about pandas and their diet and things like that. But typically, there's a kind of coherence in the ecosystem. This is one that, after I wrote it, I realized this is Aquinas, actually, in his fifth way. The characteristic behavior, namely the normal behavior of a thing, typically helps the persistence of the thing. It is the behavior of. You might think it wouldn't be like that. It's not like that for artifacts always, right? Think of the guided missile. Its characteristic behavior helps its own destruction. That's not how it tends to be in nature. The norms in any given thing tend to hang together in a unified way. We don't find, we don't think, if we're Aristotelians, that there are many entities, maybe even any, that have madly conflicting ends. Maybe to explode and to continue living. Maybe there's a few certain kinds of conflicts of ends, but it's not utter and complete chaos. Another one that I think is somewhat puzzling, I'm not quite sure what to make of this one. There are way more individuals than forms, which is interesting. Why is that? On the side of fundamental particles, if those have forms, we've got 17 forms and way more individuals. Finally, humans do not have what we might intuitively think of as evil teleology, cruelty and so on. We do have evil behavior, which falls short of our teleology. If forms did in fact reduce, or if these norms or the forms reduce to DNA or to evolutionary history, we could explain a lot of these things in terms of selection and survival. Right? Why don't we have things with, where the normal is just utterly unfitted for the environment? Well, if the normal is the typical and is unfitted for the environment, they're not going to survive and reproduce. But I think I've already suggested a number of times such a reduction is not plausible. And I think even if you could do such a reduction, you would have these difficult Mersenne questions as to which, say, DNA sequence or evolutionary histories give rise to which norms. So without a reduction, the Aristotelian metaphysics cannot use the evolutionary story, fine as it is, to explain these things, these coordination questions. We have, it seems, a certain harmony between the evolutionary material order and the order of forms, and we need an explanation of this order. Now, before I go on from there, at this point, you might say this. No, the only reason you think this is because you think there are these forms. You've made them up. You've made them up, and of course, to make them work usefully for you, you have to suppose that they coordinate, that they are correlated with the actual functioning of the organisms, that they fit in the ecological niches as well. But look, all of these problems so neatly disappear once you deny that there are forms. And I agree. These problems do disappear if we just say there aren't any forms. But so do the applications of the forms. We have to solve the philosophical problems in some other way. And yet here we had something that seemed a fairly unified solution to a whole bunch of rather different philosophical puzzles. You might think there are maybe one story you could give as a laws of nature story. Maybe there are laws of nature that specify when forms arise. So under what kind of transition in DNA from parents to children results in a transition from something for which, say, rationality is not normative to something for which rationality is normative. Could there be laws of nature like that? Some Aristotelians may bristle at this suggestion that there are laws of nature that do this, because Aristotelians tend to think that laws of nature are grounded in the forms themselves. And I don't think that's a serious objection, because we could have forms that specify the circumstances under which new forms arise. They could say maybe a form could endow an ape with a causal power to produce a human under some circumstances. The medievals wouldn't like that, because they thought the greater cannot come from the less, and they also thought the rational is greater than the non-rational. But I haven't found, to be honest, any really good argument for the principle that the greater cannot come from the less. So maybe you can find one, and then it will be an objection to this particular version of the story, but I don't know of a good argument. But even if we did this, we had this idea that, okay, so maybe the forms specify the circumstances under which new forms arise. We still get a lot of Mersenne questions, because there's a lot of fine-tuning in these laws. They're going to have lots of parameters. It is not really plausible to think that these laws are going to be elegant and beautiful laws like the laws of physics. So we're not going to escape the Mersenne questions this way. Theism, I hope, helps. It could provide a twofold explanation of the order, of this correlation between how things actually behave and what environment they're in and the norms on them. The first is, I think, theism could give us a necessity-based explanation for why there are no crazy or terrible forms, because all forms are ways of participating in God. Again, coming back to this mysterious and unexplained notion of participation from lecture 1. And secondly, a contingent story about the forms being mutually well arranged due to divine providential creation, which correlates them together. So, theism could give some kind of a fairly decent explanation of the order. It could, in detail, it could do this in one of at least 3 ways. God could be a kind of particularist and just make decisions which arrangements of matter go with which forms on a case-by-case basis. A kind of occasionalism at the level of forms. God could choose rules wisely. They might be very complicated rules, but hey, nothing's really complicated to God. To an infinite being, any finite rule is very simple in a way. He might have aesthetic preferences for the simpler ones, but maybe in biology and in ethics we really have to live with complexity. So he just has these rules for the harmony of form and matter, and then creates forms, again in a kind of occasionalistic way, in accordance with these rules as time goes on. So when he sees an organism, when he sees an arrangement of particles that would go well according to the rule with a human form, he puts a human form in it. When he sees a computer that is well suited for a computer rationality, maybe he gives it the form of a rational being, of the kind of rational being that a computer could be. Probably not a human one, because it's not going to specify that it ought to have legs, say, like our form does. Or God could have this rich form story that I hinted at in the previous slide, that the forms have rich causal powers for generating things with other forms. They're going to be very complicated. They're going to have to specify the circumstances under which those are exemplified. But again, forms are not material things, so it's not like this immense amount of information in the form is going to take up physical space. It's not like there's like a little book where all it needs to be written down. In fact, that is why forms can do a lot of this stuff, is because they are in some sense pure information. That's kind of an argument by pun, maybe not too fair. So God can choose forms that include rich causal powers for generating things with other forms. The historical Aristotle didn't like this sort of thing, but at times he had to. Empirical data forced him to admit it. At least one occasion, his famous passages about the worm and the compost heap and the heap of the composting heap. He thought you don't find any worms in the heap, and then suddenly there are worms. So the things in the heap must have some kind of worm-generating power, even though they don't have a worm form. It's kind of this was told to me as a nice example, by the way, of how empirically sensitive Aristotle is, because it's really in tension with a lot of his metaphysics of how animal reproduction works, with the same form to the same form, but at the same time, there it is empirically. Look, this heap of stuff with no worms in it, and worms come out of it. So where did they come from? Well, we now know that there were little tiny worms, presumably little worm eggs or whatever it is the worms come from, but he didn't have the optical equipment to see that. We still have this question: why does God choose these particular parameters in the form? And this applies to all these Mersenne problems, Mersenne questions. If we have a fine-tuning argument, the answer was in order to have life. Mersenne gives no answer in his science-based cases for why God chooses these parameters, and I think that's a very serious flaw in his story. I have three answers. I don't like the first one. It's just God's reasonless free choice. So we get an explanation, but it's not much of one. It's just God arbitrarily chose these things to have these particular forms. I think that shifts the explanatory bump, and we have things that are just as puzzling. This is kind of like what Samuel Clarke argued against Leibniz. Leibniz, I think, was right. This is not satisfying. Second answer is maybe God engages in some complex utilitarian-style optimization procedure and just decides what's the best set of forms to give, and to what. I think there's some problems with these utilitarian-style optimization procedures, but maybe this could work. The last answer is the one that I'm inclining to, though I think it has some difficulties too, that God freely chooses on the basis of incommensurable reasons what to make, what forms to exemplify. These incommensurable reasons are reasons that God has necessarily. God doesn't choose which reasons he has. He just finds himself necessarily with reasons, namely they're all the good reasons. I'm worried that there might be arbitrary parameters in them. I'm hoping there aren't. But that is a worry. There are difficulties with this story. I'd love to have solutions to them. The first one, of course, everybody who's a theist would love to have solutions to. It's the problem of evil, right? We're saying, yeah, God made things nice, coordinated and so on. But look, there's so much stuff that's really terrible and really awful. Maybe we get some kind of help from the idea that it's hard to coordinate a variety of forms of life. I don't know. I don't know that there's anything special the Aristotelian says here. And we get Mersenne questions about divine preferences. What about parameters in God's reasons and God's preferences? This one worries me the most, actually, in all of this. I have three stories. One is maybe divine preferences are just, in fact, logical consequences of perfection. And, of course, it kind of pushes the question back to perfection, but maybe we have some kind of Anselmian story about perfection and perfect being theology, which then could generate all these divine preferences as the perfect preferences. Second option might be that God is very free. Within some kind of a range, maybe God is always going to pursue good things, but he doesn't, in fact, have much in the way of preferences between different goods. But he always chooses good. So this is kind of a bit in the Samuel Clarke line, but not quite as not quite reasonless, maybe. And then a combination of these. Maybe some divine preferences are a logical consequence of perfection, and then there's a fair amount of freedom for God. So here's the story, right? Aristotelian forms explain many normative features of reality. They may, in fact, be needed to save a naturalistic philosophy of mind, if we think that functionalism is really the only way to go, and we are convinced that we need a notion of a proper function for functionalism. But I think one cannot be an intellectually fulfilled believer in evolution and Aristotelian metaphysics unless one has some kind of controversial metaphysics like theism, or perhaps pantheism, or perhaps optimalism, the view that everything is for the best. The last is not, I think, an alternative to theism, because if everything's for the best, then the perfect being also exists, because it's for the best that the perfect being should exist. That's a Nick Rescher argument. Thank you.